Hello, my name is Peter Miyamoto, and I'd like to invite you to the opening concert of the Odyssey Chamber Music Series 19th season. It will take place Friday, September 23rd at 7 p.m. at the First Baptist Church in Columbia. I'm really excited that on that program I will be playing Robert Schumann's first violin sonata with the extraordinary violinist Julie Rosenfeld. The sonata is a relatively late work of Schumann. It's Opus 105. For most of his life, he had hoped that he would receive a music directorship where he would be able to conduct an orchestra and maybe choirs. He finally received this in Dusseldorf in 1850. And 1851 was a very creative period for him. He returned to the genre of chamber music, and within the period of about 6 weeks, wrote both his first and second violin sonatas, as well as the third piano trio, working incredibly fast. It took him about 4 days to write the sonata that we will play. Overall, however, this period would end tragically due to his shortcomings as a conductor. He fell out of favor in Dusseldorf, and his declining mental health would lead eventually to him throwing himself in the Rhine and to his confinement in a sanatorium and eventual death there. Perhaps the demons were already surfacing within this work, which is a very dark, sets a very dark mood. The first movement begins with the violin sounding a beautiful theme in a low register. And the piano then answers with a version of the theme too. The whole movement is marked mit leidenschaftlichem Ausdruck, or with a very impassioned emotion. It's interesting that as the violin sounds that theme, the piano has an accompaniment. In which, in constant 16th notes, there are little snippets of the theme. The notes are there, but in rhythmic displacement from the violin. So it's a very unified accompaniment, very effective, the way the voices go together. However, it also creates this unease as the notes from the piano version happen at totally different times as the violins. The second movement offers some respite in that it's a very beautiful, bright F major, rather happy movement. It reminds me of the second movement of the Schumann Piano Concerto, also in A minor, and also with a second movement in F major. The piano concerto begins with the piano answered by the orchestra, piano, orchestra, together. So this very congenial, conversational F major reminds me very much of the mood of the violin sonata. Again, very conversational. This violin sonata has several episodes that contrast that nice congenial sound. Another thing that I find they have rather in common is throughout Schumann's output, especially the early works, he used musical ciphers, messages that he sent through the notes of the music, specifically because he was being kept from his beloved Clara, who he eventually married. But her father was his piano teacher and did not approve of their relationship. Schumann was 9 years older than Clara. So throughout his output, he put musical ciphers, that's been proven, but one of the main ones is the interval of the following fifth, which came to just represent the idea of his love for Clara. So in the concerto, we have this following fifth, Clara. And through his later works, these Clara motives perhaps come a little bit less often, but it's interesting to me that in this second movement of the violin sonata, there is one clear one in the minor episode. Before he brings the theme back. And it's interesting to me that this Clara motive is not the happy perfect fourth, but it's a tritone. So maybe there's a little bit of trouble in paradise. The final movement is a quick one again. In many ways, it's a perpetual mobile in that it has almost constant constant 16th note motion through one of the voices or one of the instruments for long periods. And basically it's this driven motion that drives us to the conclusion. I'll mention that there is a quote of the first theme that makes a cameo appearance towards the end of the third movement, kind of, again, unifying the whole work. And this driven rhythm creates great excitement as it drives to the exciting conclusion. So I hope you will enjoy Schumann's Violin Sonata No. 1 on the upcoming Odyssey Chamber Music Concert.
Hi, I'm saxophonist Leo Saguiguit, and I'm very honored to be performing for you at next week's Odyssey concert. I'm playing a sonata by the French composer Fernand Decruck, and saxophone repertoire really probably is not very mainstream for many of you, so I'll just give you a brief history about the saxophone. It was invented in 1840s by the Belgian instrument maker Adolphe Sax, and he wanted to create an instrument that was a little bit more powerful, that would kind of bridge the gap between the strings and the winds in an orchestra, and also between the woodwinds and the brass in military bands. Well, this idea really took off, and military bands just adopted it immediately, while the orchestras were very hesitant, except for the ones who were a lot more adventuresome. Meanwhile, back in America, the military bands also discovered these and adopted them immediately. So the saxophone became standard repertoire, standard instrumentation in all of the military bands, both here and abroad. And as early jazz was developing in America, the musicians fell in love with the saxophone when they discovered it, and it became symbolic of that new music. Meanwhile, Adolphe Sax eventually became the saxophone professor at the Paris Conservatory, since he was the only one who could teach the saxophone. But he commissioned a few composers to write for that new instrument. And for a long time, that was really the only body of solo literature, significant body of solo literature that existed. And we would have a few in between there. But after his death, it wasn't until about 50 years later that another saxophonist came along to teach saxophone at the Paris Conservatory. This saxophone professor was Marcel Mule, and he had really kind of developed a classical school of playing. He was already very famous at the time, in the 1930s, performing with a group from the Garde Républicaine, a very famous military band. And when he was appointed saxophone professor in around 1942, 1943, he had already started this wave of great saxophone works for the saxophone. And it was around that time when this piece that I will be playing was also written by Fernand Decruck. And Fernand Decruck was born in Toulouse, France. That's the southwest part of France, and she studied at the local conservatory there. And but then she would move on to the Paris Conservatory, where she studied organ, harmony, and composition there. She also studied with a very famous organist by the name of Marcel Dupré, and he was known for his amazing ability to improvise, and Fernand Decruck also developed that great skill, and she was known for being able to improvise symphonies and other pieces. She eventually went on to marry Maurice Decruck, who was a bassist, and who also played clarinet and other woodwind instruments. And he won an audition to play in the New York Philharmonic under Toscanini. So the two of them moved over to New York City. Since Maurice also, Maurice also knew how to play saxophone, he became the solo saxophonist for the New York Phil during that time. Meanwhile, Fernand would have her own very successful solo career concertizing as an organist. So as Maurice was gaining a bigger reputation as a saxophonist, they decided to collaborate. The couple decided to collaborate on a book, an educational book, like a method book for saxophone, and that became the first time Fernand started writing for saxophone. Unfortunately, in 1933, they had to go back to Paris because of an accident that Maurice sustained, where he could no longer use his hand effectively, so that ended his career as a performer. When they returned to Paris, he went on to establish a publishing house, which specialized in popular music, and incidentally helped boost the career of the very famous singer Edith Piaf. Fernand, on the other hand, had fewer concertizing opportunities when she returned to Paris, so she started to shift her focus onto composing. And Fernand has really written lots of work. Her catalog contains almost 300 pieces, and over 40 of those pieces were written for saxophone, but only a few of these are really existing in print. So a lot of these pieces that she wrote are just not available for performers. And most of the works at the time went unnoticed because at the time she wrote a lot of these pieces. They were mostly novelty pieces because the saxophone was undergoing this saxophone craze back in the 1920s and 30s. And it was only recently until her music has been revived with modern publications and recordings. Her most famous saxophone work is the Sonata in C sharp, which you will hear in this concert. And it was dedicated to Marcel Mule, who I had mentioned before, in 1943, who just became the saxophone professor at the Paris Conservatory. And he is considered the father of the classical saxophone. As I said before, Decruck's earlier works for saxophone were these novelty pieces, but the Sonata really exhibits a much more mature style that's influenced by the complex harmonies of French Impressionism. There aren't any jazz references in this sonata, but rather a more sophisticated style that evokes some folk romanticism. The sonata also distinguished itself from other French works that were written for the saxophone at the time, which tend to be more neoclassical in nature. A lot of these works that were written and have lasted for a long time during this time really originated as contest pieces written for the annual concours or the competition at the Paris Conservatory. So a lot of these pieces would definitely emphasize a lot of technical prowess. Decruck's sonata, on the other hand, does require technical skill, but the emphasis here is truly on melodic expression. It really is considered among the finest sonatas that has been written for the saxophone, and truly one of my favorite pieces to perform. Even though the saxophone was invented, smack dab in the middle of the Romantic era in the 1840s, there are very few pieces in the solo repertoire that have that romantic style. The sonata kind of comes close to that, however, even though it was written well into the 20th century. It has unabashed expression, sentimentality, and even heroic moments. So let's talk a little bit more about the sonata. The sonata is written in 4 movements, and so the framework is in kind of a conventional classical sonata. The 4 movements. The first movement, sonata form. The second movement is slow and lyrical. Third movement is a scherzo, and the fourth movement is like a rondo-like finale. But when we listen to it, it can almost sound like a 5-movement suite that's influenced by folk melodies and references to some romantic elements. Fernand Decruck uses a lot of pentatonic scales and modal melodies, and this really suggests that folk simplicity. But the harmonies that support them are really quite complex, using modern harmonic techniques such as polytonality and pandiatonicism. In the first movement, you're definitely going to hear the undeniable influence of Debussy and Ravel in the Impressionist harmonies. The melodies are simple and expressive, but they have these broader romantic phrases and gestures, and it's placed against this backdrop of these lush harmonies that are waving in these arpeggiated figures. The second movement is titled Noel, and as you would assume, it does in fact contain a French Christmas carol from the 15th century. Decruck here transforms it into more of a haunting melody by switching it over to the Phrygian mode. The third movement is entitled Fileuse, and this can be translated literally as a girl who spins wool into yarn, also known as a spinster, but not in its contemporary definition. But musically, it can refer to the song a maiden sings while sitting at a spinning wheel. This is a medieval folk reference that has inspired a lot of romantic composers, including Schubert and Mendelssohn, Bergmüller, as well as Fauré, whose songs you will also hear in the program at the concert preceding the Decruck Sonata. The characteristic figures that you'll hear in the Fileuse are these very rapid movement of notes that suggest the spinning wheel, and they typically serve as the accompaniment to a lyrical melody. In this particular case, Decruck brings those rapid figures to the forefront as the featured part of the solo, but also incorporates a French children's counting song to contrast these swirling figures, and thus still maintaining that folk character in the sonata. And then finally, we go to the fourth movement, and this begins with a very reflective nocturne, which again, another romantic reference if you think of Chopin, etc. And then this segues into the rondel, and as that suggests, kind of a small rondo. And the music will start to pick up intensity gradually, and we start to hear the appearance of some march-like theme, alternating with these dazzling repeated figures. And from that, emerges this triumphant melody for a dramatic conclusion of the sonata. I hope that you will enjoy this piece as much as I truly enjoy playing it, and hope you enjoy.
Hello, my name is Stephen Tharp, and next Friday I'll be presenting, along with pianist Bomi Kim, Fauré's beautiful La Bonne Chanson at the Odyssey Chamber Music Series. This wonderful cycle of 9 songs by Fauré represents a real breakthrough in his songwriting, where he had always been a tuneful melody smith and constructor of beautiful songs before. He now showed himself a real master of complex forms, constant modulations, and the tumult of excited emotions that really reflect the poetry that Verlaine was writing in his poetry cycle, also called La Bonne Chanson. Now, what are the poems about, and what is the song cycle about? Well, Verlaine was in his 30s and had met a woman named Mathilde Motet and was quite taken with her. She had a rather strict mother, and there were some difficulties getting the marriage arranged, but eventually they set a date, and Verlaine responded to this poetically in an absolute outpouring of poems about his joyful impending marriage, about his fiancée, about her beauty, about his hopes and fears for the marriage. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't turn out all that well. The song cycle turns out much better than the marriage did. They had a rocky and brief marriage, and he eventually left Mathilde for the poet Arthur Rimbaud. That relationship didn't turn out very well either. Verlaine was a complicated man, to say the least. We think you'll really enjoy these beautiful songs that are filled with a very French kind of passion. It's passion that is just barely controlled. Unlike Italian songs where everything is hard on sleeve, the French always hold something back in reserve. So there's always the feeling that something is bubbling just beneath the surface of these songs. They're really delightful. Bomi plays them beautifully, and I hope that you'll enjoy my singing as well. So we look forward to seeing you at Odyssey next Friday for the beautiful program of Schumann, Fauré, and other composers. See you then.